titled The Migrations That Made India. Tony Joseph on his deep dive into ancient India in conversation with Sujaan Mukherjee. While our speakers come onto the stage, I'll give you brief introductions of our speakers. Tony Joseph is an Indian journalist and former editor of Business World magazine. He's also the author of the best-selling book Early Indians, The Story of Our Ancestors and Where We Came From. Until 2018, he was also the chairman and co-founder of Mindworks Global Media Services. Tony will be in conversation with Sujaan Mukherjee, who is a part of DAG's Museums Initiative, heading the research and development team. He holds a PhD from the Department of English at Jadavpur University on history and memory in public spaces in Kolkata. I'd now like to invite Tony and Sujaan on stage, please. Sujaan, I now hand over the proceedings to you.
Hello. Yeah, is this audible? Okay. Very good morning to everyone who has joined us here today. Big thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to the Tata Steel Bhubaneswar Literary Meet for organizing this and for hosting what I hope will be an exciting discussion to start off the day. Exciting and intriguing. I only recently read Tony Joseph's book, Early Indians, the story of our ancestors and where we came from. And it's a real pleasure to share the stage with him. Thank you, Tony, for joining me on stage. Because it's a book that, it raises a lot of questions, it answers a lot of questions, but most importantly, it prompts us to, and in a way also provokes us to think beyond, certain very narrow ideas with which we understand how our civilization is the way it is, So that way I think it's really been a kind of an eye-opening book for me in many ways. And I hope for those of you who have read it in the audience, you feel similarly. And if not, then of course, this should hopefully encourage you to go back and read the book. So, Tony, since the introductions are out of the way, should we just start with the first question that I was thinking of, which is that, when you read the book, you realize that it's one of those books that comes from, those kinds of, those itching curiosities which you just have to answer. So often these projects come out of these questions that we have, to which we don't have the answer, and trying to find that answer, we open up a whole world of possibilities. So was there something like that which prompted you to write this book?
Yes, indeed. I think that, first of all, thank you for the kind introduction. And it's nice to be here in Bhubaneswar today. What started me on the book was actually a much smaller, but to me, a vital question. Who were the Harappans? You had read about the Harappan civilization all along, but there never really was a real good answer to the question, what happened to them? Where did they go? Well, what happened to them, they were guesswork on what could have happened to the civilization. But there was not even enough guesswork, I would say, on where did they disappear? Did they have something to do with us or not? So that's how the project started. And then slowly it dawned on me that you can't answer the question of who the Harappans were unless you grappled with the question of who the early farmers were, because the Harappan civilization grew naturally out of the spreading agriculture in northwestern India, which you can see from the archaeological record. And you can't answer the question who the first farmers were unless you answer the question, so who were the first Indians? So by and by, as I started working on the project, it's just expanded in scope out of all shape. And so that's how it started. So I think that now we have answers to all of those questions, but it took me 6 years. 6 years, when I normally say it took me 6 years, people assume that it's on top of other things that I must have been doing, but that's not so. It's 6 years. I had given up everything else during this period. So it's 6 years of focused work on just one issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, your book came out in 2018.
That's right.
Right, and this is 2022, and the book has really kind of traveled well. And as I was reading it, so many of the points that come out as a result of your quest for this one answer also seem very relevant. The other thing that I was saying, I mean, of course, this is also the 100th year that Mohenjo-daro's ruins were kind of, Rakhal Das Bandopadhyay discovered those ruins, and that in a way kind of comes across the importance of Harappa and the importance of tying in population genetics with other disciplines like archaeology or like linguistics. So I think the next question for me would be, you speak of, I mean, just to kind of, give a sense of what the book presents and what is the larger narrative that we are working with here. So in your book, you mentioned there are 4 major waves of migration that we see, right? So would you like to elaborate a little on that? And maybe from that, we can go into questions of how that kind of helps us understand the present or misconceptions about the present.
Yeah. The book essentially tries to answer a simple, straightforward question: where did we come from, and who were our ancestors? And but the interesting thing is, answering that simple, straightforward question opens up and gives answers to a whole lot of other questions that had remained not clearly answered until now, such as why do we have 4 different language families? Indo-Aryan, Dravidian, Austroasiatic, Tibeto-Burman, and why are they spread the way they are around the subcontinent? When did the caste system begin? Why do we have so many observable similarities among all of the communities of South Asia? That's so clear. And also, why are there so many differences between the communities in South Asia, starting with, let's say, the diet? As in my book, I explain how northern and western Indians consume far more milk and far less fish and meat, while eastern and South Indians consume far less milk and far more fish and meat. So their consumption of animal protein is in completely different ways. So all of these answers become, these questions become clearer when we have the answer to that simple question. But the reality is that the answer to the question of how populations formed was not clear, not just in India, but anywhere in the world until very recently. But in the last few years, dramatic breakthroughs in a new discipline, relatively new discipline called population genetics, has started answering those questions in a much more definitive manner. And those answers tie in very well with evidence from archaeology, linguistic, and other factors. So based on this evidence, what we can now say is that the 4 classes of migrations that shaped the demography of the world, not just India, not just South Asia, 4 major classes of migrations. And these classes of migrations lasted These were not flashes in the pan. These were not things that lasted years, decades, or even centuries. In some cases, that lasted millennia. So that's why these are different from normal migrations, flash in the pan migrations that we talk about. These are what shaped the world population. So what are those four classes of migrations? First is the out of Africa migration that happened around 70,000 years ago, when a small band of people from Africa, no more than a few hundred people, moved out into the Arabian Peninsula, and then over the next few thousands of years, went on to populate the rest of the world. The last continent to be peopled by them was the Americas, and that was around 16,000 years ago, or somewhat earlier. So between 70,000 years ago and about 16,000 years ago is when the peopling of the world happened. So this is the first class of migrations, which are called the out of Africa migrations. And you could say these were determined by climatic factors, depending on when the glacial ages receded, when ways opened up, etc. The second class of migrations began when, after the last glacial age, people who had already settled moved into different parts of the world, many of them started experimenting with agriculture. This would have been some 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. Many of those experiments were not successful. Some who were successful were not sustainable. But four groups of people were pretty lucky. These were people in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in India, and China. These were the early populations that were successful domesticating cereals, because cereals are far more productive than many other kinds of plants and animals. And these four population groups is where agriculture began in a big manner. And when agriculture begins, the natural result is a population boom in a major way, because settled agricultural populations grow in a far faster manner than hunter-gatherers. And these transitions into agriculture resulted in huge migrations that lasted millennia. So this is the second class of migrations, which you could call agriculture-related migrations, driven by the global factor called man's mastery over nature. The third class of migrations began when a small group of people in the Central Asian steppe region mastered the arts of metallurgy, wheels, horses. Essentially, they mastered mobility, and they could move far faster than any modern Homo population group in earlier history. And they changed the demography, and they moved all across Eurasia. They changed the demography all across the large Eurasian mass continent. The third class of migrations, all of which happened in prehistory, that is before we discovered writing. The fourth class of migrations happened in the historical period, and we or our grandparents have seen it, which is the colonial migrations, which is driven by man's mastery overseas, when a small group of people in Western Europe impacted the demography of many large parts of the world, from the Americas to Australia to many other parts. So these are the four classes of migrations that shaped global demography, out of which one of them did not have a large impact on Indian demography, which is the last colonial migrations, because the colonial migrants who reached India were too few in number compared to the existing population. So India's population was shaped by three classes of migrations and four actual migrations.
Yeah, this is a very interesting point, because, I mean, we normally, when we are thinking of history as, you know, when our conception of history is in shorter time periods, the impact of colonialism seems to be huge. Of course, I mean, there is cultural impact, there's social impact.
Yeah.
What you're speaking of specifically is the genetic, demographic impact. But do you think that even if the intermixing because of the migration wasn't significant, the conditions of society that were produced by colonialism enabled a different kind of genetic transition or transformation?
Not genetic transformation. We talked about four actual migrations that shaped Indian demography. and all of them were over by around 3,500 years ago or 1500 BCE. But there were many migrations, invasions that happened after that, even in the historical period. The Huns, the Shakas, the Persians, the Arabs, the British, the Portuguese, and migrations of, there are so many migrations that happened. None of them changed the demography of the country, but many of them left a significant mark on our culture. In a societal manner, they did have a large impact. Some of them, most migrations had large impacts, but not in the sense of demography or genetics.
Right. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. The other question that I had based on what you were sharing now about these four waves of these four classes of migration is that, while you were trying to answer this one large question that set you off on this journey, what comes out of your research, what comes out of the narrative that you string together helps us address a lot of questions that are very relevant to us in the present day.
Yes.
I mean, at one point in your book, you mentioned that, how history is used by political organizations to build certain kinds of narratives. And in your research, what comes through is a very, it really kind of forces us or makes us rethink what we understand of, say, something like the caste system. Yeah. Right? So how would you say that kind of came out of your work, and what are the implications of that you derive from population genetics?
If you had to sum up what, how these new findings should change our idea of ourselves, I think is that I would like to take a parallel from many other. There was a time when people thought that man is the center of the universe, or that the earth is the center of the universe. People thought that the places that they occupied was the center of was the very center of the world. We know that none of this is true. We thought that there is one singular moment when the modern human appeared, and that when he appeared, he was far superior to all other beings then existent. We now know this is all completely wrong. There was no singular moment when a particular person emerged as a modern human. It was a gradual process. At all points of time, it's a process. It's a process in the making, and it involved multiple intermixing between different species of the different members of the Homo species. We also know that the modern human were not superior to other members of the Homo species. They did not bring in a dramatically new understanding or an artistic sensibility when they appeared. So all of these things are human constructs meant to make oneself or one's people feel important. But they're not correct. As we know, in fact, it's very uplifting to know that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. In the context of what we now know is that the Indian population and its civilization is the result of multiple migrations that happened in prehistory. And this is so not just for India, it's true for all large human populations. They're all the result of multiple migrations. So the long-standing idea that we have had, that Indian civilization comes from is unisource. For example, the Arya Sanskrit Vedic culture is the foundational source, or the only source of Indian civilization, is now not defensible. The Arya Vedic Sanskrit culture is an important and very significant part of Indian culture, but it is not the earliest or the only one. The Harappan civilization that preceded the arrival of the steppe migrants precedes the Arya Vedic Sanskrit culture by far. So the way that we understand our civilization and our culture needs to change into where we are a multi-source civilization that draws its impulses, its culture, from very many different migration histories.
Yeah, I agree with you that it's it's a much more, I mean, to not hold on to some very um, singular ideas of this, to not hold on to this kind of sense that, you know, there's this something special about a particular civilization or a particular culture, and to kind of open that up to see ourselves as part of this process is in fact a lot more exciting. I mean,
Well, your part of something does make it special. Your
yeah,
family is special to you
yeah, yeah, yeah.
because it is your family. So there's nothing wrong in saying that feeling special about something, you're part of it. But to say that you're feeling special about your family makes your family superior
Superior,
to everything
exactly.
else, everyone
Yeah,
else,
yeah,
that's a very limiting and limited point of view.
absolutely. You also mention some very interesting, I mean, the way that you kind of look at how the Aryan, I mean, the migration of the Aryan populations happened.
Yeah.
That is also something that I found very interesting in terms of how you narrativize it and what are the possible implications of the population genetics perspective on it. So would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. But the first thing I would like to
Sure,
say
yeah.
is that the book talks about four migrations that shaped Indian demography. And the most interesting thing is that about three of those migrations, nobody has any problems. Nobody has ever uh, stood up and said, "Hey, this is problematic." There is only one migration that there is that gets some of the that gets politically heated up, and that's the migration. The last major migration that happened between 2000 BCE and 1500 BCE, which is the migration of the steppe pastoralists from Central Asia into India, which has now been repeatedly shown up by genetic evidence, which ties in with the existing evidence that we have from linguistics. So, to me, the important question to ask is, why is, out of all four migrations, why is their sensitivity it is about only one? I think the sensitivity exists because of the wrong impression that the Arya Sanskrit Vedic culture is the foundation of that. Because if you say that is like all other civilizations that may have come from elsewhere, then that's equivalent to saying all of our civilization culture is imported, which is not true. The Harappan civilization, for example, as I said, which is in a way the foundational source of the Indian civilization, because it was the largest civilization of its time, and it existed in its mature form for nearly 700 years. And when the civilization declined, they spread all over the subcontinent. So about the last major migration, I think even the recent papers that came out after my first hardback edition, which has now been, these papers have now been included in the updated paperback edition, like the Rakhigadi DNA study, further supports and expands the details of the Arya migration.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way of looking at it, and why this is the one that causes, I mean, why it's at the center of this kind of sensitivity. Um, just to kind of
And
go,
two more
yeah,
things I will need to add. The other misconception that if you say the steppe migration brought Indo-Aryan languages to India, then people assume that this means they brought the Vedas with them. No. The earliest Veda, the Rig Veda, already has within it, bears the imprint of the impact made by pre-Aryan languages in India,
right.
such as the retroflex consonants, which means even the earliest parts of the Vedas, the oldest Veda, the Rig Veda, was composed in the Indian subcontinent. That's not something they brought with them. It already bears the imprint
Right.
of the interactions that it had with others. All migrations result in mixing culturally, genetically, and that is precisely what happened. So it's not as if there was one migration and they stayed separate. We now know from genetics that within, after all these migrations arrived, let's say from between 2000 BCE to nearly 2000 years until 100 CE, nearly 2000 years ago, there was significant mixing between all the population groups.
Just to kind of go off on a slightly different trajectory now that we have spoken about the larger narrative that you set out in your book. What I found very interesting is how you managed to kind of, because as a science journalist, if you're not a researcher per se, then for you to kind of access this material, to read it, to stay updated, and to process it in a way that makes it more accessible to a wider readership, that must have required some level of training in terms of reading, and support from others also, because you mentioned in your acknowledgements that it's an unusually sort of long list of acknowledgements. So I think what is also interesting to me is the process through which you came about this method, and this kind of particular tone where you don't compromise on the narrative, where you don't compromise on the details, but you still manage to string together a larger narrative, which is so difficult to do.
I think the basic resource that you need if you are starting on something like this is time. And as I said, it took 6 years of undivided attention to this topic, because some of the disciplines when I started and encountered them were new to me, and this would not have been possible without the very generous time given by scientists and academics across the fields that one was studying, which is population genetics, archaeology, linguistics, epigraphy. List goes on, at least six major disciplines. Many of them spent repeated multiple hours of time talking about their papers, what they meant, what is yet to be found out, how that differs from earlier work. And this was the major part of the work involved in creating the book, and this wouldn't have been possible without them.
So you also mention that, especially when you're talking about the Harappan civilization, in that chapter, you mention that population genetics offers a part of the picture. So some of the prehistory can be understood through that. But you also mention that it requires other disciplines like archaeology or like linguistics to come in with their inputs as well in order for us to have a complete picture. So do you see work of this nature happening in those disciplines, of someone who's kind of trying to collect all of this and understand its broader significance in a way?
People do. I mean, if you look at the major history books which have become the standard textbooks for history, whether it is Professor Romila Thapar or Professor Rupinder Singh, you would say it draws on multiple sources of information cutting across disciplines. What I have been able to do in my book is to look at some old questions in the light of new research that has been coming in from one particular discipline, but also in the context of all the other evidence that we have. And that is the integration of the evidence from population genetics with all the other evidence, especially from archaeology. That is something that is new. And I think when there's one thing to be kept in mind. It is tricky to be pulling in evidence from multiple disciplines. It is tricky because different disciplines have different starting points, different assumptions. So therefore, their conclusions need not be comparable or easily comparable. To give an example, if you ask an archaeologist, when did the first modern human arrive in India? It is possible that some of them would say 100,000 years ago, 120,000 years ago. But if you ask a geneticist, he's unlikely to say it is beyond 65,000 years ago or so. So this would look like a major contradiction, but it is not, once you understand that their starting points and their research methodologies are different. Archaeologists have access to materials left behind by people or modern humans in ancient history. So based on that, they would arrive at the answer to the question, when were the first modern humans here? Geneticists work with genetic material of ancient as well as modern, and they are answering the question, when did the ancestors of the presently living populations arrive in this subcontinent? So their answer would be different. But these two answers being different are not necessarily contradictory because they're answering slightly different questions. It's possible that the earliest modern humans who arrived 120,000 years ago perished and did not leave behind a lineage that continues today. So I think this is just an example. So you need to understand the differing starting points and assumptions of different disciplines.
And that's a very critical point, because that's also the sense that I was getting while reading your book, that you're very conscious of the different approaches and the different kind of methods that the different disciplines adopt. Yeah. The other question, I mean, I think we'll discuss a couple of more points, and then we can open up to the audience in case there are questions from the audience on the book. The other question that I had is that, you know, when you mention these 4 classes of migration that go back to 70,000 years ago, I am also thinking in terms of what is now, what the term that is gaining currency, this idea of looking at the Anthropocene as a kind of geological epoch, right? I mean, even though it hasn't been formally accepted, it's still a concept that is becoming more and more popular, becoming a part of our critical vocabulary about understanding human lives, non-human lives, climate, all of that. Do you see, I mean, since it's almost impossible, I mean, the time periods that you talk about extend over thousands of years. So if we are in the middle of something like that, it's unlikely that we as individuals would recognize it, you know, that we are part of this huge change.
Yep.
So is it possible that there is a kind of climate-driven migration that is happening even as we speak, which can potentially impact the genetic constitution of the race?
I normally speak of, let's say, speculate that we might be living through a 5th class of migrations, which only future historians a few hundred years ago, or maybe a couple of 100 years later, can definitively answer. We talked about the driving factors behind all of the earlier classes of migrations. And in my opinion, the driving factor behind this 5th class of migrations happening now could be 2. Both of these are differences in the economic prosperity levels of different communities and the population growth rate of different communities. And we are seeing significant migrations happening from communities with higher population growth rates and lower prosperity levels to regions where population growth rates are low. And I think this is where the climate change also fits in, because climate change affects the economic prosperity levels of different regions. But the question is, how long-lasting will this be? Will this be, because it's too early to speak definitely about this, because the other migrations lasted, as we said, for thousands of years. So it's too early to ask, but it's a possibility that this could be the 5th class of migrations that change global demography.
The other sort of question that I had while I was reading the book again is, you know, it's a very well substantiated argument that you present, in the sense that your research is all there. There is also what I find particularly, moving in a certain way is the fact that there is no hubris of very deterministic scientific understanding. I mean, you constantly keep that space for speculation, keep that space for, of revision, of updating the research that remains always open. So that for me is something very quite inspiring to have that to see that in a particular book or in a particular project. But what I also felt is that, the arguments that you're making, they have a certain kind of, let's call it a philosophical import as well, which is what we were discussing a little while back about, not seeing the specific race, the specific, subgroup that we belong to as superior, this idea of decentralizing, our perspective of the world and all of that. But, while you argue for this kind of, while you gesture towards a geneticist's understanding of the origins of the caste system or of these migrations, I also feel that somewhere a lot of these ideas, a lot of these prejudices that come are not often based on a factual engagement with the world, right? They are based on some other cultural or some social understanding of the world, which are fact resistant in a certain sense.
Yes.
So do you see any way in which writing like yours or other kinds of writing can bridge the two, or are these just kind of two parallel discourses that must go on?
You're absolutely right on this. And I think there has been multiple research studies that have shown that once people make up their minds on some issues, which are particularly those issues related to issues of identity, that no amount of reasoning or new data can change that position, because it is too painful to confront identity-related issues that you have identified yourself with. Is there a way to? I'll come to that question later, but not everybody has already made up their mind on issues in an identity-related manner. There's a large number of people who have not yet.
Absolutely.
And a lot of them would also be youngsters.
Yeah.
So to them, reason-based, evidence-based arguments are what will help them make up their mind. So that is useful. Second, to answer the question, is there another way to deal with that? Yes, I think that another way to deal with that would be through literature, arts, entertainment. That would be the way to deal with that.
Thank you, because that's a really kind of empathetic response to that question. So, absolutely. And so far as the usefulness of your book is concerned, I mean, I have absolutely no doubts there, because like I was telling you before as well, apart from the 200 odd pages that build up this narrative of the prehistory, of where, of who the early Indians were, of how we came into being, of how this kind of genetic pool constituted itself. After that, you also provide a very helpful summary and a series of frequently asked questions. Yep. So for me, it was not just a book that you read for the narrative. It's also a very useful kind of toolkit, which you can, I mean, it sounds wrong to talk about the usability of a book, but it is a very usable book in the sense that it makes that information accessible in very different, I mean, multiple ways. So how did that happen? Was that there in the first edition, or is that something you felt you needed to kind of
Very interesting. Yeah, no, it was not there in the first edition. And the idea came from Ms. Chiki Sarkar, who is the founder and publisher of Jagannath Books. And I think that was a wonderful idea, because it, and the questions, I said, you send me I didn't want to frame the questions, so I thought the questions should come from people who have the questions. So they asked around to people who had read the books. Okay. And that's how the questions came up. I just provided the answers.
Okay, so that's a very interesting way of, archiving the afterlife of the, afterlife of the first edition in a way, and making it part of The second, are you calling it an edition or a reprint?
No, this is
Seems
a
like an edition.
this is an updated
It's an
edition,
updated edition.
updated
Right.
paperback edition,
Right.
because it has included a few major papers that came out after the 2018
Yes, yes, yes,
edition.
yes. Okay, so I have a couple more questions that we could go into, but before that, shall we open this to the audience in case there are questions from? Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
First of all, sorry, I think we came in a little bit late, so you might have covered this point already. So sometime back, there was this very ambitious human genome project from, I think, National Geographic, where you could give your sort of DNA and they could trace your ancestors, who came from where. And I think that has stopped now. But do you have any comment on that, the authenticity or the usefulness of that?
There are a lot of companies that are doing this today. Map my genome, or lots of companies who are doing this today. It's not, and this is not something that I have done or have felt curious enough to do. But there are lots of people who do this, and I think a lot of it depends on the categorization they make of this haplogroup, etc., and how deep they go, etc. And I think their definitions, and therefore the more insight that you get, has been improving in recent times. But yeah, if you're curious, it is definitely an interesting thing to do.
Okay, so my question was more than, if I read between the lines, you would not put too much on the usefulness, or because you didn't mention it.
Sorry, I can't hear.
I was asking that, can I assume that you would not put too much sort of on the authenticity or accuracy of this, or do you have no comment on that?
Your question is, can you hold it?
You'll put too much weight on the authenticity
Of the
authenticity or the rigor of.
not the result. I think I would focus attention on how did they classify those haplogroups. When they say you are from Africa, what period are they talking about? Because if you go back 70,000 years ago, everybody is from Africa, right? So you have to look at what periods are they picking to choose your haplogroup belongs to this period or that period, because it differs over time, because people have been moving. So those are the kind of issues that you would look at, not the data per se.
Thank you for that question, sir. Anyone else who has a question? And trust me, the book actually not just addresses these larger questions, but also very simple ones, which, I mean, we've always wondered, so how similar do we look to the early
Indians,
to the early Indians, so questions like that also, which seem completely trivial and fun, but reveal very interesting answers. So if you have any questions, please go ahead.
People sometimes think, I mean, as I was saying in my book,
Yeah.
people sometimes think that since modern humans arose in Africa, the Africans, the people in Africa today, are somehow closer to the early modern human. But the fact is, chronologically, they are as far away from those people as we are, which means during the same period, they have gone through the same level of mutations and changes as anybody else. So these are some of the insights that you get as you look at the implications of what we find.
I'd like to ask you about Yuval Noah Harari and his book, and what is your take on how much interest that has generated in talking about early Indians?
I can't hear you properly. Can you?
I'm talking about Yuval Noah Harari and his
Yeah.
book. So what do you think his role has been in generating this interest in talking about the early humans in the early that sort of period?
What has generated the interest? No.
The book.
No, what has generated the interest in Yuval Noah Harari's book, or what has generated interest in human history?
Yes. Do you think his book and his work has helped generate more and more interest in the
Humanism.
work of early
His book has been phenomenally successful on a global basis. it did bring accessibility to many of these issues in a manner that is accessible to common readers and brought it out of the scientist domain. My job has been far more difficult. Yuval Noah Harari could say that this is what it is, this is what the science says, and leave it at that. The issues that I am dealing, my book had to deal with, many of them are hot potatoes. If I said this is what the science says, nobody is going to say, yeah, that sounds about right. In each of those cases, you have to go into why does the science say what it says, what is that assumption based on, how does it compare with other. So Yuval Noah Harari can build a very beautiful garden because you're talking about a very complex subjects and writing about it in a manner that is accessible to everyone. My book, when I came out, I had no clue. First, whether I would find a publisher, because I have not written earlier on history. Two, whether even if it is published, anyone would read it, because large parts of it are going to be pretty technical. And I can't do nothing about it, because the book will not stand if I just said, this is what the science says. Believe me. So you had to go into a lot of technical details. So it's much more like building a fortress. But to answer your question, there are two things. Today there is far greater clarity about prehistory in general. So since there is much greater clarity about prehistory in general across the world, there's more stuff to read. And secondly, in India, I think there is greater curiosity about our prehistory. This is quite different from the curiosity. This is about identity, all of those things. So it's both of those things, I think.
So you mentioned this in your book, of course, but I was wondering if for the audience, if it would be good to elaborate on why there has been this burst in the last couple of decades or so in prehistory, and what has changed that has made so much accessible now, which wasn't before.
As I said, one of the key things has been, for example, the fact that there were 4 classes of migrations in that manner could not have been articulated before. Because until somewhat recently, it was not a consensus opinion that modern humans arose from Africa and spread out around 70,000 years ago. And that required quite a lot of genetic understanding. So each of those migrational histories and this understanding of migrations that shaped world demography is recent.
Is that something, I mean, is there a technological reason behind it, or how is that?
Yes, it is to the fact that, every discipline goes through a period when it is making dramatic changes.
Mm-hmm.
And then they cool down a bit.
Right.
Then the further changes that happen are interesting. It makes everything a little clearer, but they are no longer dramatic. Population genetics went through that dramatic phase a few years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, when it discovered the beauty of understanding ancient DNA.
Right. Any other questions from the audience? There's also, while we wait for that, I was also wondering if there's any other project in the pipeline that you're thinking of.
Yes.
If it's not a secret.
No, I've talked about it. I think the early Indians practically ends with the arrival of all the 4 large components of Indian demography. Right. And the last migration would have lasted from 2000 BCE to 1500 BCE, which means the book practically ends around 3,500 years ago.
Right.
Even though there is an epilogue that deals with some critical factors, because you thought in a book of this kind you can't leave something like this unanswered. So epilogue deals with a few issues of when did caste arise.
Right.
But other than that, it doesn't deal with periods after that. Yeah. So this book will look at, so they all were here by around 1500 BCE. So then what happened? So this is the question that the next book will answer.
Wonderful. Looking forward to that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So if there are no more questions, I think it's about time that we wrap up the session. I'll just wait another minute in case there's any hand up in the audience. Questions, comments, observations, anything really. Okay, I guess, so with that, we'll bring this discussion to a close. For me, it was a really exciting way to understand and to kind of, position ourselves also as readers in this long history, because it does change the perspective on a lot of things that we take for granted in terms of where we stand with respect to the world or with respect to time. So I hope that more of you will have the opportunity um, to experience that, to read early Indians. Um, and yeah, I mean, let me close by thanking the Tata Steel Bhubaneswar Literary Meet for organizing this session, and of course to Tony for sharing the stage with me and for sharing your wonderful insights about your book. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sujaan. It has been a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Thank
you
you.
to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir, for talking about early history in such an interesting way, and thank you, Shujan,